Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where the past settles gently over your eyes like a velvet shroud. You didn't strangle them, but you did make sure no one ever saw them again. Ooh, ominous. If you enjoy collapsing kingdoms, inconvenient heirs, and bedtime stories laced with treason, please like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is for you over there. As always, our gratitude and appreciation for your support goes unmatched. Thanks for helping this cursed little channel grow. Tonight, you take the crown by making your nephews disappear, then spend the rest of your reign pretending you didn't notice they were gone. Close your eyes. The fire is low. Your breath is quiet. The room is still. The sheets are warm, and the silence is waiting. You feel it, that sleepy weight in your chest, that creeping hush behind your ribs. You've been king for weeks now, and no one dares ask where the boys went. Their rooms are empty. Their guards dismissed. The tower is very quiet these days. Down the corridor, your crown sits heavy on its cushion, and outside, London forgets how to breathe. Sandalwood drifts from the chapel. The torches hiss. A knock echoes somewhere far away. It's time. You rise. And England dreams of treason it can't prove. It was July 1483, and Richard III sat on a throne that whispered accusations with every creak of ancient wood. The coronation had been magnificent, Westminster Abbey draped in cloth of gold, nobles bowing in their finest velvets, the holy oil glistening on a king's brow. But in the Tower of London, two sets of royal apartments stood empty, their previous occupants having vanished into history's most convenient disappearance. The princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, had simply stopped being seen, like actors who'd exited stage left and forgotten to return for their bow. Nobody asked where they'd gone because everyone suspected the answer came with sharp edges and shallow graves. Richard attempted to rule as if legitimacy could be manufactured through good governance. He issued laws with the enthusiasm of someone trying to change the subject. His legal reforms were genuinely progressive, establishing bail for accused criminals, protecting property rights, conducting proceedings in English rather than law French. It was justice administered by a man whose own justice was severely in question. The Court of Requests was established to hear poor men's complaints, which was admirable if you didn't think too hard about two boys who'd never get to complain about anything again. The Royal Progress of summer 1483 was a masterpiece of pretending everything was normal. Richard travelled north, dispensing justice and royal favour with aggressive generosity. York received him with genuine warmth. The north had always been Richard's stronghold, appreciating his fair governance as Duke of Gloucester. But even northern loyalty couldn't quite drown out the whispers following macquedance in the royal wake. Where were the princes? Why had they stopped appearing at windows? Why did servants who'd attended them suddenly have nothing to say? The nobility's response to Richard's reign was a study in calculated ambivalence. They attended court, accepted offices, and participated in ceremonies with the enthusiasm of people who understood that opposition was unhealthy. But their smiles never quite reached their eyes, and their oaths of loyalty sounded like recitations rather than convictions. Everyone was waiting for something, though nobody was quite sure what. Perhaps for bodies to surface, perhaps for alternative claimants to appear, perhaps for God to express an opinion through the traditional method of battlefield victory. Parliament had declared the princes illegitimate, based on Bishop Stillington's convenient revelation about Edward IV's pre-contract. The legal reasoning was sound if you didn't examine it too closely or ask why the bishop had waited 20 years to remember this crucial information. Bastards couldn't inherit thrones, everyone agreed. But bastards also didn't usually vanish into thin air, leaving behind only rumours and empty rooms. The legitimacy question had been answered, but it had been replaced by a mortality question that was somehow worse. The Tower of London loomed over Richard's reign like a guilty conscience made of stone. It had always been a royal residence as well as a prison, but now it seemed more tomb than palace. The rooms where two boys had played were sealed off, officially for renovation. The servants who'd attended them were reassigned or retired with suspicious generosity. The Tower Ravens, legend said, knew secrets they couldn't speak. But even without words, their presence was accusation enough. Richard's attempts to build support were undermined by the very suspicions he couldn't address. He couldn't produce the princes because they were gone. He couldn't admit they were gone because that would confirm what everyone suspected. He couldn't deny they were gone because their absence was obvious. It was a logical trap that tightened with every passing day, every unanswered question, every empty window in the tower. The king was caught between silence that damned him and speech that would damn him more. The church's position was delicately neutral. They'd crowned Richard with proper ceremony, acknowledging his legitimate claim through parliamentary declaration. But prayers for the princes had quietly ceased, and sermons about divine justice took on pointed relevance. Some bishops supported the new king with genuine conviction. Others supported him with a kind of enthusiasm that suggested they were keeping their options open. God's will was notoriously flexible when it came to English succession. By August 1483, the pattern of Richard's reign was established. He would rule efficiently, reforming laws and dispensing justice. His supporters would praise his governance while avoiding questions about his nephews. His enemies would multiply in shadows, united by suspicion rather than loyalty to any alternative. And always, there would be the silence where two boys' voices should have been. It was government built on an absence, legitimacy constructed around a void. The irony was that Richard might have been a good king under different circumstances. His legal reforms showed genuine concern for justice. His administration was efficient and relatively honest. His military experience could have protected England from foreign threats. But all these qualities were overshadowed by two empty rooms in the tower and questions nobody dared ask aloud. You could be the best king in the world, but if people thought you'd murdered children to get there, excellence became irrelevant. As summer turned to autumn, Richard's court took on a peculiar quality. It functioned normally on the surface. Ceremonies were performed, justice was dispensed, diplomacy was conducted. But underneath ran currents of unease like underground rivers. Nobles who'd accepted the new regime began reconsidering their options. Messages flew to Brittany, where Henry Tudor, that Lancastrian nobody with a genealogy that required creative interpretation, suddenly seemed less impossible. If Richard could take the throne through parliamentary declaration, perhaps others could too. The silence of the princes was louder than any accusation. It echoed through Westminster's halls, reverberated in council chambers, and whispered in the confessionals where guilty men sought absolution for knowledge they couldn't admit. Richard sat on his throne, wearing his crown, issuing his laws, and fighting the one enemy he couldn't defeat, the absence of two boys who should have been alive. Every day of his reign would be haunted by their non-presence, every achievement shadowed by their disappearance. The crown was his, but it was a crown built on silence, and silence, Richard was learning, was the loudest accusation of all. By October 1483, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, was experiencing the medieval equivalent of buyer's remorse, except what he'd bought was a king, and what he wanted to return was his loyalty. Buckingham had been instrumental in Richard's rise, supporting him at every crucial moment, standing beside him as he took custody of Edward V, backing his claim to the throne. He'd been rewarded with power and position, made Lord High Constable of England, given authority second only to the king himself. But something had gone wrong between the coronation and the autumn, something that transformed the Duke from kingmaker to king-breaker. The exact reasons for Buckingham's change of heart were as murky as Thames mud. Perhaps he'd expected more rewards and received less than his ambition demanded. Perhaps the disappearance of the princes had shocked even his flexible conscience. Perhaps he'd discovered his own claim to the throne through the Beaufort line and decided being king was better than serving one. Or perhaps, as some whispered, he knew exactly what had happened to the princes because he'd been involved, and guilt was eating him alive like particularly judgmental worms. Whatever the reason, by October, Buckingham was plotting rebellion with the enthusiasm of a convert. The conspiracy that developed was a masterpiece of medieval networking. Messages flew between England and Brittany, where Henry Tudor was transforming from footnote to alternative. Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, worked within England with the dedication of a spider spinning a web across a kingdom. Bishop Morton, imprisoned by Buckingham but apparently converting his captor, provided ecclesiastical legitimacy. Disaffected Yorkists who couldn't stomach Richard joined Lancastrian diehards who'd never accepted any York king. It was a coalition united by hatred rather than love, which in politics was often stronger. The plan was ambitious in its scope and optimistic in its assumptions. Buckingham would raise the south and Wales, where his lands gave him theoretical power. Henry Tudor would invade from Brittany with ships and soldiers provided by Duke Francis. Other conspirators would rise simultaneously across England, dividing Richard's forces. The princes being dead or disappeared meant Richard's removal wouldn't create a succession crisis. Henry would marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, uniting the Roses and ending the dynastic conflict. It was elegant on parchment, which should have been the first warning. October 18, 1483 was set as the day of coordinated uprising. Buckingham raised his standard at Brecon, proclaiming Richard a usurper and murderer. The response was underwhelming in the way that natural disasters are overwhelming. Instead of flocking to his banner, the Welsh weather decided to express its opinion through biblical flooding. Rivers burst their banks, bridges washed away, and Buckingham's army dissolved faster than sugar in the rain that wouldn't stop falling. It was rebellion by drowning, and the Duke was the one going under. The weather that destroyed Buckingham seemed personally offended by rebellion. The Savern became an impassable torrent, cutting off communication and reinforcement. Roads turned into rivers, camps into swamps, and morale into memory. Buckingham's tenants, who owed him feudal service, discovered urgent business elsewhere that didn't involve drowning for a duke they didn't particularly like. The Great Rebellion was becoming a great embarrassment, washed away by rain that seemed sent by a god who preferred Richard III to alternatives. Richard's response to the rebellion was swift and merciless. He'd been in Lincoln when news arrived, and he moved south with an army that stayed remarkably dry. More importantly, he moved with money, proclaiming rewards for Buckingham's capture that turned loyalty into a competitive sport. The Duke found himself abandoned faster than you could say treason, his own retainers calculating that royal gold spent better than rebel promises. By November 2, Buckingham was captured, tried, and executed in Salisbury marketplace. No trial needed much time when the accused had publicly proclaimed his treason. The execution was swift, but the aftermath was revealing. Buckingham reportedly begged to see Richard before his death, claiming he had secrets to reveal. The king refused, which was either prudent or suspicious, depending on your perspective. What secrets did Buckingham take to his grave? The fate of the princes? The extent of the conspiracy? Or just the desperate bargaining of a man who'd gambled everything and lost? The Duke died on All Souls' Day, which was poetically appropriate for someone about to become one. Henry Tudor's part in the rebellion was equally damp. He'd sailed from Brittany with 15 ships, arriving at Plymouth to find the coast suspiciously empty of supporters. Either the rebellion had failed, or this was the world's least enthusiastic welcome party. Tudor, showing the caution that would characterize his reign, sent scouts ashore rather than landing himself. They returned with news that Buckingham was dead, the rebellion was over, and Richard's soldiers were waiting with the kind of patience that suggested they were being paid by the hour. Henry sailed back to Brittany, disappointed but alive, which in medieval politics counted as a win. The collapse of Buckingham's rebellion should have strengthened Richard's position. He'd defeated a major uprising, executed a dangerous duke, and sent Henry Tudor scurrying back to exile. But victories in civil wars were like wounds. Even when they healed, they left scars. The rebellion had shown that opposition to Richard could unite Yorkists and Lancastrians. It had proven that significant nobles would risk everything to remove him. Most dangerously, it had established Henry Tudor as the alternative, transforming him from nobody to somebody through the alchemy of opposition. Richard's response to victory was revealing. He attainted the rebels wholesale, confiscating their lands with enthusiasm. But he also started a propaganda campaign that suggested insecurity rather than strength. He issued proclamations detailing Henry Tudor's illegitimate descent, which was true but protested too much. He emphasized his own legitimate claim, which was legal but required explaining. Kings who were secure didn't need to justify their crowns quite so loudly. The redistribution of rebel lands created its own problems. Richard rewarded his supporters, particularly northerners who'd remained loyal. But placing northern lords in southern positions created resentment among locals who found themselves governed by outsiders. It was colonization within England, and the colonized didn't appreciate the civilizing mission. Every northern appointment created southern enemies. Every confiscation created dispossessed heirs plotting return. Victory was breeding future defeat. Christmas 1483 was celebrated with hollow magnificence. Richard held court as if rebellion hadn't happened, as if his throne was secure, as if two princes hadn't vanished. But the attendance was thinner, the laughter forced, the loyalty performative. Buckingham's empty place at the high table was louder than his presence had ever been. The Duke had been executed, but his ghost haunted the feast, reminding everyone that even the highest could fall if they opposed the king. The new year brought new concerns. Henry Tudor, safe in Brittany, was attracting exiles like a magnet attracts iron filings. Margaret Beaufort, despite her son's failed invasion, continued working within England with the patience of water wearing away stone. The French were making interested noises about supporting Tudor, understanding that England's instability was France's opportunity. And always, there were the whispers about the princes, the questions about legitimacy, the doubts that no amount of efficient governance could dispel. Buckingham's rebellion had failed in its immediate aims, but succeeded in its implications. It had shown that Richard could be challenged, that alternatives existed, that the throne won through disappearing nephews could be lost through appearing rivals. The Duke was dead, but the seeds he'd planted were germinating in exile and discontent. Richard had won the battle, but the war for legitimacy continued. And in that war, the king was fighting with the handicap of two missing princes, and the growing conviction that he knew exactly where they weren't. Henry Tudor had spent 14 years in Brittany, perfecting the art of being professionally harmless while secretly ambitious, like a sword pretending to be a butter knife. His claim to the English throne was the genealogical equivalent of connecting dots that weren't meant to be connected. Through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, great-great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, through a legitimised bastard line that had been specifically excluded from succession. It required squinting at history, ignoring several laws, and pretending that conquest couldn't override paperwork. But in the winter of 1483-84, with Richard III sitting on a throne built from disappeared nephews, suddenly weak claims started looking stronger. Margaret Beaufort was the kind of mother who played the long game with the patience of geology. While her son festered in Breton exile, she worked within England like a termite in the foundations. Married to Lord Stanley, whose loyalty was so flexible it could touch its own toes, she had access to court while maintaining plausible deniability. Her communications with Henry were conducted through physicians, merchants and priests, people who travelled without suspicion and carried messages in medicine bottles and prayer books. She was building a network one careful strand at a time, and Richard was too busy fighting open rebellion to notice the subtle one. The French connection transformed Henry from pretender to possibility. Pierre Landois, who governed Brittany for the mad Duke Francis II, had kept Henry as a useful diplomatic counter. Not quite prisoner, not quite guest, definitely not free to leave. But by 1484, Landois was facing his own political crisis, and Richard was offering good money for Tudor delivery. Henry, warned by Bishop Morton that he was about to be sold like particularly valuable livestock, escaped to France disguised as a groom. It was undignified but effective, which would become something of a Tudor trademark. The French court received Henry with the enthusiasm of people who'd found a wonderful stick to poke England with. Charles VIII was young, his regents were pragmatic, and supporting Tudor cost relatively little, while potentially causing Richard enormous problems. French gold began flowing to the exile community. French soldiers were promised for invasion. French ships were prepared for channel crossing. It wasn't altruism, it was investment in English instability, and the French had always been excellent at that particular market. Henry's promise to marry Elizabeth of York was political genius wrapped in romantic packaging. Here was the solution to 30 years of dynastic warfare: unite the Roses through marriage, heal the kingdom through matrimony. The fact that he'd never met Elizabeth was irrelevant. The fact that she was technically illegitimate by parliamentary declaration was fixable. What mattered was the symbolism. a Lancastrian heir marrying a Yorkist princess, ending the conflict through bedroom diplomacy. It was hope marketed as prophecy, and people bought it because they were tired of the alternative. The exile community around Henry was a fascinating collection of the desperate and ambitious. John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, had spent 10 years imprisoned in Haymarsh Castle before escaping to join Tudor. Jasper Tudor, Henry's uncle, provided Welsh connections and military experience. Former servants of Edward IV, disgusted by the prince's disappearance, mingled with Lancastrian diehards who'd never accepted any Yorkist king. It was a coalition of the dispossessed, united by hatred of Richard rather than love of Henry, but hatred was often a stronger bond than affection. Richard's response to the Tudor threat was characteristically thorough but somehow inadequate. He issued proclamations detailing Henry's base birth, his lack of legitimate claim, his dependence on foreign enemies. All true, all irrelevant if people preferred a foreign-backed bastard to a nephew-killing usurper. He strengthened coastal defences, maintained a navy, created an early warning system of beacons. All sensible, all useless if key nobles decided to switch sides at crucial moments. Richard was preparing for invasion, while Tudor was preparing for defection. The propaganda war was conducted with medieval creativity. So Richard emphasised his English birth, his proven governance, his legitimate claim through Parliament. Henry promised reconciliation, restoration of confiscated lands, and most importantly, clean hands regarding disappeared princes. Welsh bards sang of the return of Arthur. Henry's Welsh name was Harry Tudor, prophesied to return and restore British greatness. It was nonsense, but it was powerful nonsense, to people who wanted to believe in something better than the current situation. Christmas 1484, at Henry's exile court, was modest but hopeful. The gathering of exiles in Paris represented England's alternative future. Nobles who'd lost lands, merchants who'd lost trade, soldiers who'd lost causes. They feasted on French wine and English dreams, toasting a king who wasn't yet crowned in a kingdom he'd barely seen. Henry himself was reportedly cautious, methodical, already showing the penny-pinching tendencies that would characterize his reign. He was the un-Richard, careful where the king was impulsive, calculating where Richard was emotional. The intelligence networks of both sides worked overtime. Richard's spies reported on Henry's preparations, his gathering forces, his French subsidies. Tudor's agents reported on English dissatisfaction, wavering nobles, defensive weaknesses. Both sides knew invasion was coming. The question was when and where. Henry needed to land where he could gather support before Richard could respond. Richard needed to respond wherever Henry landed before support could gather. It was a strategic puzzle where the pieces were human loyalties and the board was England. The death of Richard's son Edward of Middleham in April 1484 had tilted the balance further toward Tudor. Without an heir, Richard's throne became a temporary arrangement rather than a dynasty. Even if he held power, what then? Another succession crisis when he died? Another round of civil war? Henry offered continuity through Elizabeth of York and her potential children. It was future versus present, and in medieval politics, dynasties thought in generations. By early 1485, the Tudor alternative had evolved from impossible to inevitable. Not because Henry's claim had improved, it remained laughably weak by any legal standard. Not because his forces were overwhelming, they remained modest and French. But because Richard's position was weakening through the acid of suspicion and absence. Every month, without the princes, strengthened belief in their murder. Every defection to Tudor weakened Richard's support. Every French coin in Henry's coffers brought invasion closer. The psychology of the situation favoured the challenger. Richard had to defend everywhere, Henry could attack anywhere. Richard had to maintain loyalty, Henry only had to create doubt. Richard carried the burden of vanished nephews, Henry carried only ambition. In the arithmetic of usurpation, clean hands counted for more than legitimate claims. Being suspected of regicide was worse than being guilty of weak genealogy. Spring 1485 brought preparations on both sides. Richard strengthened his defences, called up his levies, secured promises of support from nobles whose promises were worth exactly what they'd been paid. Henry gathered his forces in Normandy. French mercenaries, English exiles, Welsh dreams. and the kind of desperate hope that made men risk channel crossings in medieval ships. Both kings, for Henry was already calling himself king in exile, knew the confrontation was coming. England would have to choose between the devil it knew and the devil it didn't. The Tudor alternative was built on negatives: not being Richard, not having disappeared nephews, not being currently on the throne. But sometimes negatives were enough. Henry Tudor offered England a chance to start over, to pretend the last 2 years hadn't happened, to wash away the blood of princes with the blood of battlefields. It wasn't a particularly attractive offer, but it was better than continuing with a king whose throne whispered accusations every time he sat on it. The last Plantagenet and the first Tudor were about to meet, and England would decide its future through the traditional method of seeing who was still standing when the fighting stopped. Anne Neville died on March 16, 1485, during an eclipse of the sun, because even the cosmos understood dramatic timing. Richard III's queen had been fading for months like a manuscript left in sunlight, growing paler and thinner while the court pretended not to notice. The official cause was consumption, that convenient medieval diagnosis that covered everything from tuberculosis to poison. She was 28 years old, had been queen for less than 2 years, and left behind a husband who was running out of family faster than he was running out of friends. The death of their son Edward of Middleham the previous year had broken something in both royal parents. The boy had been their only child, the future of Richard's line, the justification for everything that had been done to secure the throne. When he died at Middleham Castle, aged 10, the succession died with him. Anne never recovered from the loss, turning inward like a flower closing against winter. Richard reportedly aged years in months, the crown growing heavier as his bloodline grew lighter. The timing of Anne's death was suspiciously convenient for everyone except Anne. Within days, rumours began circulating that Richard had poisoned his wife to clear the way for a new marriage. The favourite candidate for new queen, according to court whispers, was Elizabeth of York, his own niece, Edward IV's eldest daughter. It was the kind of rumour that spread because it was too horrible to be false, or perhaps too logical to be dismissed. Elizabeth was young, fertile, and marrying her would neutralise Henry Tudor's promise to unite the Roses through the same marriage. Richard's response to these rumours revealed how damaging they were. He took the extraordinary step of publicly denying any intention to marry his niece, which was rather like denying you'd thought about robbing a bank. It just made people wonder why you'd brought it up. He had the mayor and aldermen of London assembled to hear his denial in person. He swore before witnesses that such a marriage had never crossed his mind. The more he protested, the more people believed the opposite, because medieval kings didn't usually feel the need to deny incestuous intentions unless those intentions existed. The court during Anne's final illness had been a strange mixture of death watch and political calculation. Nobles attended the dying queen while simultaneously calculating what her death might mean. Would Richard remarry quickly? Would he choose foreign alliance or domestic consolidation? Would the lack of an heir make his position untenable? Anne lay dying while around her, courtiers played chess with her death as the opening move. It was grief performed in public, which meant it wasn't really grief at all, but politics dressed in mourning clothes. Elizabeth of York's position during this period was impossibly delicate. She was attending her aunt's deathbed, while rumours suggested she'd soon be in her aunt's bed. Her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, had emerged from sanctuary and made peace with Richard, which either showed pragmatism or desperation. The younger Elizabeth was caught between being her uncle's niece and potentially his bride, between honouring her dead aunt and possibly replacing her. Court observers noted she dressed particularly well during this period, which was interpreted as either showing respect for queenly office or advertising for it. The funeral of Anne Neville was conducted with appropriate solemnity and inappropriate speculation. She was buried in Westminster Abbey with all the ceremony due a queen, while courtiers whispered about who might be the next one. Richard appeared genuinely grieved, though whether for his wife or his situation was debatable. He'd lost his son, his heir, and now his queen. The dynasty he'd killed for was dying out through natural causes, which had a certain divine justice to it that surely someone noticed. The political implications of Anne's death were immediate and severe. Without a wife, Richard couldn't produce legitimate heirs. Without heirs, his throne was a temporary arrangement. Without dynasty, loyalty became a short-term investment. Nobles who might have supported a king with future now reconsidered supporting a king without one. The math of monarchy required multiplication, and Richard was running out of family to multiply. The marriage market for kings was limited and limiting. Foreign princesses required negotiations that took time Richard didn't have. Domestic candidates were either too young, too old, or too closely related. The Elizabeth of York option, whether real or rumoured, showed how desperate the situation had become. Marrying his brother's daughter would have been canonically impossible and politically suicidal. But the fact that people believed he'd consider it showed how few options remained. By April 1485, Richard's court was hemorrhaging loyalty like a wounded animal bleeding out. Nobles found urgent business on their estates that required immediate attention. Council meetings were increasingly sparse, like dinner parties where half the guests had remembered previous engagements. The king was ruling an emptying kingdom, his proclamations echoing in halls that grew quieter each day. Even his northern supporters, traditionally loyal, were hedging their bets with the careful calculation of men who'd survived previous regime changes. The contrast with Henry Tudor's situation was stark. While Richard lost family, Henry promised to create one through marriage to Elizabeth. While Richard's court emptied, Henry's filled with exiles eager for restoration. While Richard grew isolated, Henry gathered allies with the magnetism of alternative hope. The living king was being outlived by the pretender, who hadn't even landed yet. Death was winning through absence, absent princes, absent heir, absent queen, absent loyalty. Spring 1485 found Richard increasingly alone. His wife was dead, his son was dead, his nephews were disappeared, and his brother Edward had been dead for 2 years. The Plantagenet line that had ruled England for centuries was reducing to a single point, a king without family, without heir, without future. He issued proclamations with royal authority, but authority without continuity was just temporary power. He prepared for invasion with military skill, but skill without support was just delayed defeat. The propaganda war intensified as both sides recognized the dynastic implications. Richard emphasized his proven ability, his English birth, his divine appointment. Henry emphasized his promise of renewal, reconciliation, and most importantly, reproduction through Elizabeth. One offered a present without future, the other offered a future without present. For a kingdom exhausted by 30 years of civil war, the choice was becoming clearer. Better a weak claim with strong prospects than a strong claim with no prospects at all. The final irony was that Richard might have been a competent king if he'd had time and family. His legal reforms showed genuine concern for justice. His administration was more efficient than his brother's had been. His military experience could have protected England from foreign threats. But all these qualities were meaningless without the basic requirement of monarchy, the ability to pass it on. Anne's death hadn't just taken his queen, it had taken his future. As summer 1485 approached, Richard III ruled a kingdom that was technically his but practically already lost. Every absent face at court represented a calculation made against him. Every empty seat in council was a vote of no confidence. Every day without an heir was a day closer to irrelevance. The last Plantagenet sat on his throne surrounded by ghosts of family and shadows of supporters, waiting for the Tudor alternative to transform from threat to reality. Death had been busy in the House of York, and it wasn't finished yet. On August 7, 1485, Henry Tudor landed at Mill Bay in Pembrokeshire with approximately 2,000 men, and the kind of audacious hope that made sensible people invade kingdoms with foreign mercenaries. His force was a mongrel assembly, French soldiers who fought for pay, English exiles who fought for restoration, and Welsh supporters who fought because the bards said Arthur was returning. Henry kissed the ground when he landed, either from piety, relief at surviving the Channel crossing, or recognition that this might be the last friendly soil he'd touch. The dragon banner of Cadwaladr was unfurled, proclaiming the Welsh prince come to claim his British inheritance, which required creative interpretation of both Welsh and British. Richard III received news of the landing with the grim satisfaction of someone whose worst expectations had been met. He had been waiting at Nottingham Castle, centrally located to respond to invasion from any direction. The beacon system he'd established worked perfectly, fire racing across hilltops faster than horses could gallop. Within hours, he knew where Henry had landed, approximate numbers, and direction of march. What he didn't know was who would answer his summons to arms, and, in civil wars, that was the only intelligence that mattered. Henry's march through Wales was less military campaign than recruiting drive with armour. At Haverfordwest, Carmarthen and Brecon, Welshmen joined the Dragon Banner with the enthusiasm of people who'd been waiting for a prophecy to fulfil itself. The fact that Henry had spent most of his life in Brittany, speaking French, was irrelevant. He was Welsh enough when Wales needed him to be, and after centuries of English oppression, Wales was ready to be needed. Rhys ap Thomas, who'd sworn to Richard that Henry would only cross into England over his body, solved this oath by lying under a bridge while Henry rode over it. Medieval oath-keeping at its finest. The Stanley situation was the knife edge on which everything balanced. Lord Stanley and his brother Sir William controlled enough men to tip any battle decisively. Lord Stanley was also Margaret Beaufort's husband, Henry Tudor's stepfather, and Richard III's prisoner in all but name. His son, Lord Strange, was held hostage at Nottingham, guaranteeing good behaviour that everyone knew would last exactly until battle was joined. The Stanleys raised their forces and marched, carefully positioning themselves to support whoever was winning when winning became clear. It was fence-sitting as military strategy, perfected by a family who'd survived by never committing until commitment was safe. Richard's summons to his nobles produced responses that ranged from enthusiastic to invisible. The Duke of Norfolk came with substantial forces and genuine loyalty. The Earl of Northumberland came with substantial forces and suspicious reluctance. Many others discovered urgent business that prevented immediate attendance, sick relatives, estates under attack, sudden religious conversions requiring pilgrimage. The king, who'd alienated support through disappeared nephews, was discovering that loyalty purchased with other people's lands was worth exactly what he'd paid for it. The two armies converged on the Midlands like iron filings drawn to a magnet made of ambition. Henry had gathered perhaps 5,000 men by the time he reached Leicestershire, a respectable showing for foreign invasion but hardly overwhelming. Richard commanded perhaps 10,000, superior in numbers but inferior in certainty. The royal army was larger but brittle, held together by obligation rather than conviction. Henry's force was smaller but focused, united by the simple goal of replacing Richard with anyone else. In the arithmetic of battle, motivation often counted more than mathematics. August 21 found both armies near Market Bosworth, preparing for the battle that would end the Wars of the Roses, or at least this chapter of them. Richard spent the night at the Blue Boar Inn in Leicester, reportedly sleeping badly and dreaming of the princes. Or perhaps that was Tudor propaganda, adding ghostly torment to physical defeat. Henry spent the night in camp, reportedly calm and calculating, already showing the penny-pinching caution that would characterize his reign. Both men understood that tomorrow would crown one and probably kill the other. The battlefield at Bosworth was unremarkable. Rolling hills, marshy ground, the usual English countryside that had seen too much blood over the last 30 years. Richard positioned his forces on Ambion Hill, giving him tactical advantage. Norfolk commanded the vanguard, Northumberland the rear, the king himself the centre. The Stanley forces sat apart, watching and waiting with the patience of carrion birds who knew dinner was coming. Henry's army approached from the southwest, smaller but compact, French mercenaries in the centre providing professional spine to amateur enthusiasm. The night before battle was spent in traditional preparations. Weapons were sharpened, armour adjusted, confessions heard. Letters were written to be sent in case of death, wills updated with medieval haste. Richard reportedly wore his crown into battle, either from confidence or fatalism. If he was going to die, he'd die as a king. If he was going to win, he'd win wearing the symbol of what he was fighting for. It was theatrical, but then the entire situation was theatre, the last act of a drama that had been playing for 30 years. Morning of August 22 came with mist that would clear to reveal England's future. Both armies heard mass, because God was traditionally on everyone's side, until victory proved otherwise. Heralds made final offers of pardon to anyone who'd switch sides, producing minimal movement. Most men had made their choices, or had their choices made by their lords. The Stanleys continued watching, their neutrality more ominous than any hostile movement. Everyone knew they would eventually choose. Everyone wondered when and for whom. The battle lines formed with medieval precision. Banners flew identifying lords and loyalties. Richard's royal standard showed the white boar, his personal badge. Henry's showed the red dragon of Wales and the arms of England he didn't quite possess yet. Between them lay a few hundred yards of English soil that would soon be worth a kingdom to whoever held it when the dying stopped. The stage was set for the last battle between the last Plantagenet and the first Tudor. Oxford led Henry's vanguard forward as the morning mist lifted. The French mercenaries advanced in professional formation, while Norfolk's men prepared to receive them. Arrows flew, bills clashed, and men began dying for kings they'd never met over principles they didn't understand. Battle was joined, messy and brutal as medieval battles always were. But everyone understood this was just the prelude. The real decision would come when Richard decided whether to wait, like a king, or fight like a soldier. As the fighting intensified, one thing became clear. Northumberland wasn't moving. His forces sat immobile despite orders to advance. Whether from treachery or tactical assessment, the Earl was keeping his options open. The Stanleys also remained stationary, watching Richard's forces engage while calculating odds with the precision of men who'd bet on many kings and intended to bet on one more. Richard was fighting with half an army while the other half watched to see if he was worth fighting for. The moment of decision came when Richard spotted Henry Tudor's standard across the field. Here was the chance to end everything with one charge. Kill Henry, and the invasion died with him. The Pretender had no heir, no backup claimant, no alternative to himself. It was winner-take-all in the most literal sense. Richard gathered his household knights, men bound to him by personal oath, and prepared for the charge that would make him victorious or dead. There was no middle ground left, and Richard had never been a man for middle ground anyway. The charge of Richard III at Bosworth Field was the last magnificent gesture of medieval English kingship. A crowned king leading household knights in a desperate gamble for kingdom. Richard had seen Henry Tudor's standard vulnerable on the field, protected but not unreachable, and made the calculation that killing the Pretender was worth risking the king. He spurred down Ambion Hill with his household guard, perhaps 200 men, who'd sworn to die with him and were about to test that oath. The white boar banner streamed behind as the last Plantagenet king charged into history with the kind of courage that was either inspirational or insane. The impact was devastating. Richard's charge carved through Henry's bodyguard like a sword through silk. The king himself killed William Brandon, Henry's standard-bearer, with his own hand. He unhorsed Sir John Cheney, a giant of a man who was supposed to be unbeatable. For a moment it seemed the battle would end as Richard intended, with Henry Tudor dead and the invasion decapitated. The Pretender's forces wavered as their leader came under direct attack from a king who fought like he had nothing left to lose, which he didn't. This was the moment the Stanleys had been waiting for. Sir William Stanley, watching Richard fully committed and vulnerable, finally chose his side. His forces, fresh and uncommitted until now, charged not to support their king but to destroy him. The red jackets of Stanley's men crashed into Richard's exposed flank like Judgment Day arriving early. The household knights, overwhelmed by numbers and betrayal, began to fall. Richard fought on, crown still on his head. Refusing quarter, he probably wouldn't have been granted anyway. The end came in the marsh at the foot of Ambion Hill. Richard's horse was killed or mired, hence the famous cry, a horse, my kingdom for a horse!" Though whether he actually said it or Shakespeare invented it hardly matters. What matters is that the last English king to die in battle died fighting, surrounded by enemies who'd been subjects moments before. The crown was hacked from his head, his armour stripped away, and the white boar of York trampled into bloody mud. Richard III died as he'd lived, violently, controversially, and without his nephews to witness it. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Richard's body was stripped naked, thrown across a horse, and paraded through Leicester for public display. It was medieval England's way of proving the tyrant was dead, though calling him tyrant was easier now that he couldn't respond. They buried him at Greyfriars with minimal ceremony, a king reduced to a corpse that needed disposing. His grave would be lost for centuries, found eventually under a car park which had a certain poetic justice to it. Even in death, Richard couldn't escape being paved over by progress. Henry Tudor was crowned on the battlefield with Richard's circlet placed on his head by Lord Stanley, who'd waited until the last possible moment to commit. It was kingship by combat victory, the oldest and simplest claim to throne. The pretender with laughable genealogy was now Henry VII by right of conquest and Stanley timing. The Wars of the Roses hadn't ended so much as exhausted themselves, with the last Yorkist king dead and the first Tudor king crowned in blood and opportunism. The marriage to Elizabeth of York followed with unseemly haste. Henry needed Yorkist legitimacy to supplement his Lancastrian inadequacy. Elizabeth needed protection for her family from Tudor revenge. Together, they'd create the Tudor dynasty, uniting the Roses through bedroom diplomacy. Their children would be both Lancaster and York, ending the division by making it irrelevant. It was peace through procreation, and it actually worked, which was more than anyone expected. The Tudor rose, combining white and red, became the symbol of reconciliation that everybody pretended to believe. Never mind that it was reconciliation at sword point. Never mind that Yorkist claimants would haunt Tudor nightmares for generations. Never mind that the peace was built on Richard's bones and cemented with marriages of convenience. England was tired of civil war, and if that meant accepting a Welsh exile with dubious claims and good timing, so be it. At least he hadn't allegedly murdered his nephews. The battlefield at Bosworth grew quiet as August evening fell. Bodies were stripped, wounded finished, and loyalties hastily rearranged. Noble prisoners were taken for ransom, common soldiers for labour or hanging. The detritus of medieval battle, broken weapons, torn banners, dead horses, littered ground that would become famous for hosting England's transition from medieval to modern, or at least from Plantagenet to Tudor, which was change enough for most people. England had a new king, a new dynasty, and new problems disguised as solutions. Henry VII would rule with the paranoia of someone who knew how easily crowns could change heads. He'd tax with enthusiasm, trust nobody, and create a stability built on fear rather than love. But he'd rule, and his son would rule, and his son's son would rule, until that line too exhausted itself. The Wars of the Roses were over, officially. Unofficially, they'd echo through Tudor paranoia about Yorkist claimants for decades. The sun set on August 22, 1485, on an England that had changed dynasties through the traditional method of killing the previous dynasty. Richard III was dead, naked on a horse, crown in Tudor hands. The princes in the Tower were still missing, their fate now sealed with their uncles. Whatever happened to them, no confession would come from Richard's dead lips. They'd remain history's most convenient disappearance, useful for blackening Richard's memory and justifying Henry's usurpation. As night fell on Bosworth Field, carrion birds descended for their feast. They didn't care about dynasties or legitimacy or the divine right of kings. They cared about dinner, readily available across a field where England had traded its past for its future. The Wars of the Roses had begun with blood at St Albans and ended with blood at Bosworth. In between lay 30 years of killing over who got to wear a fancy hat and sit in a special chair. Medieval monarchy at its finest. Sleep well, Richard III, last of the Plantagenets. Your nephews are still missing, your dynasty is extinct, and your reputation will be argued about for centuries. But you died as a king, fighting like a king, which is more than most get. Sleep well, England. You've traded one dynasty for another, one set of problems for different ones. The Tudors are coming, with their taxes and their suspicions and their eventual break with Rome. But tonight, rest. The Wars of the Roses are over. The wars of religion are yet to come. Good night. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace.